All right. Hey, LinkedIn family. This is Monique Braham-Evans with episode number 2 of Don't Stay Silent. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Ben Molinari. Now, to give a little bit of background, Ben actually reached out to me when I did my call out to friends and asking, hey, do you want to talk about something? Let's get vocal. What's that topic? Hit me up. He didn't hesitate and said, Monique, I want to talk about toxic masculinity. So I could sing his praises all day long. But Ben, why don't you say hello and do a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, I appreciate you. Thank you, Monique, for having me. This is a great space to be able to have a really open dialogue about some things that, quite frankly, sometimes we don't have as many open dialogues about. So my name is Ben Molinari, as Monique mentioned. I am a Publicis Group employee. I'm actually currently on paternity leave. So this is kind of like, this is probably the most work-related. Actually, probably the only adult I've talked to outside of my wife for a minute. So I'm happy to be here. I've been in the advertising space professionally for 10, 12 years, on the sales side for some time. And then a company that I was a part of was acquired by Publicis Group, and I've been there for some time. But yeah, I'm excited to get into it, specifically this topic. And I really appreciate you for giving us the space to talk about this.
Awesome, awesome. So on my first episode, I had index cards, but the questions are getting longer. So I have a big old notepad right here.
All right.
So let's get into it. All right. So everybody's favorite pastime is back, sports. And with that having been said, the NFL Network's Lindsay Rhodes said, the truth is that most of us have found ourselves awkwardly laughing off inappropriate comments, bending over backwards to make comfortable a man who just made us uncomfortable. What, in your opinion, has to be done in heavily male-dominated sectors like sports so that women can go from cowering down to standing up against instances of sexual harassment, verbal abuse, and other forms of toxic masculinity when they're clearly outnumbered?
Yeah, it's a comment that likely has been raised many times before. So we're just seeing another example of that happening in a male-dominated space. What has to be done is, I think we talk a little bit. We will get into a little bit of this concept of intersectionality, but you know, throughout the course of sports in general, right? Like, we're starting to see sports are a platform in a lot of ways for people to talk about things, right? It is a huge audience. You talked about it as America's favorite pastime for sure, but globally, athletes have a huge platform. There's privilege associated with that. And now as we see athletes talking about race, which has been going on for some time, but now the world seems to be maybe listening a little bit more. This is another topic too that athletes very much can talk about. And we see athletes that are fathers of daughters, guys like LeBron, being vocal about, just the women in their lives, but also women and their treatment of women and their respect for women as equal, and also the need for women to have voices in the sports world. And I think that that's something that, we need our athletes also to step up in that way as well, as they are for race, but also to not sort of proliferate the stereotypes of an athlete and their treatment of women.
Absolutely. And to stick with sports for just a little bit longer, female sports journalists in a Washington Post article talked about the terrible experiences they've had to endure from being shown pornography at an interview site or being on the receiving end of unwanted sexual advances. But the cost or the price they've had to pay goes beyond just bad behavior of men. There's been an impact on how they do their job, how they compete for stories, and whether or not they can even stay in the profession. I know we started talking about sports, but looking beyond, what implications does toxic masculinity have to the female workforce?
I mean, it has the implication of basically you have a choice to make. You know, that's what that's saying, is that basically a male-dominated workspace or is saying to a woman in that situation, you have a choice to make. You can have this job, right? But it's going to be on my terms, right? I'm going to show you these things to offer myself some sort of gratification because this is a choice that you're making, that you have to deal with this, that this is, you know, to use a sports analogy, par for the course, so to speak, but like that is what is that's saying to a woman. So what kind of choice is that for a woman to make, is to say, well, I want my job, but it's at stake if I don't participate in this. So I think we're seeing, again, we need powerful people with privilege in spaces that have platforms to be extremely vocal about when these things happen and to call out their colleagues. And that's how you hold people accountable.
Yeah, for sure. So we're in the middle of August, but November isn't that far away, being an election year. I can't help to think about, 4 years ago and some of the mind-blowing things that apparently just went ignored when it came to the ballots. I recently saw an article and it talked about an Adam Carolla interview with Donald Trump Jr. And he was talking about things like his dad's penis size or sleeping with Miss USA candidates. All of that was just fair game in the interview. What happens when toxic masculinity is pervasive in politics and running rampant amongst our most senior government officials? What does this mean or even have to say about our future in our country?
Well, what it says is, and what it said for a long time, is that we need a woman to run this thing. And I'm happy to hear, just as of recently, that not only just a woman, but a Black woman is going to be the vice presidential candidate, is a vice presidential candidate, and hopefully the vice president of the United States. But I think ultimately, it's the same thing that happens when you have a bunch of predominantly white men in a room, creating that boys club culture, recycling the same narratives in a vacuum of just approval of one another and the disgusting things that are happening. I mean, this isn't, and the reality is it's not just Donald Trump, right? Like, I mean, there's thousands probably of politicians and executives, and we know that, right? We know we may like Bill Clinton's politics better, but we know his history, right? With with sexual abuse and utilizing his privilege and power, and so we know we have a lot of examples of that. So this is something that's been going on for a very, very long time, and this is recycled generation to generation, and from one space within politics to another, or one industry to another. So again, men holding men accountable is a place that I'm hopeful that we can start to move to more, with more men talking about and calling each other out, and not in a private way. So that's very important. And again, I think the narrative is very clear that the country, doesn't seem to, the majority of the country, or a good majority, doesn't care about these things, because this is like, it's the mentality of boys will be boys, right? I think, to add another layer to it, we take it's a white man that is able to brag about these things. So if this was a Black man, that would be a very different story. That narrative would be very different. That person would be hypersexualized and called a predator. So I think this white male narrative being recycled over and over again, and being able to abuse your power, and we know it's got to stop. The only way that we are able to really stop it at the highest level is to have hopefully more women in positions of power, and then and also male allies, in positions of power as well.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear, what is your response to toxic masculinity being disguised as cultural norms or preserving certain values?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing that it's an easy thing to hide behind. And this is something that, like, when we were talking about having this conversation, I did not get a gender studies degree. I am not an expert. My experience, and I know what I know, but I try. It comes down to empathy, right? And like, how do you be radically empathetic, where you try to put yourself in somebody else's position and at time sacrifice your own privilege. I know I have the most amount of it, so it's going to take some sacrifice to give it to spread that around, right? So I think when you start to take that and say, these are cultural norms, that's because you're enjoying your own privilege so much that you don't care about anybody else, and that there's no empathy whatsoever. It is, and we're seeing the effects of that in the world. We're seeing lack of community. We're seeing closed, closed spaces shutting people out. We're seeing that it's crumbling our republic. I mean, it is the antithesis of what America was supposed to be. We know that there's flaws in that, but if we want to actually try to reinvent and or get to that place, we have to start dispensing or equalizing or leveling out our privilege and disseminating it into other groups.
Wow. All right. So we both work in media.
We do.
And we both know that for a long time there's been a boys club at the top. I will say that in recent years it's gotten better, and we've seen progress with women advancing to senior positions, albeit Caucasian women, I might add.
Sure.
But still, is the boys club an instance of toxic masculinity? Why or why not?
Yes, ultimately, yes, it is. That's a yes or no question to me. I think at times, like many, that's not a characterization of any one particular man, or we've all made, including myself, have made choices that are not. We probably weren't even aware of those. Maybe they weren't intentional. I think intention is the key, right? We need to be more intentional about when we're using, and the term toxic masculinity, right, is just perpetuating the constructs that are masculinity, the hyper masculine things that we have perpetuated for some time. So being more intentional about that will enable us, hopefully, to embrace our femininity or other things that are part of who we are as men. So it is a proliferation of it. There's no question about it, because men talk to other men about guy stuff, right? And then it creates a space where people share these common values that are, one, toxic, but they're recycled and they're comfortable. And they're traded almost amongst those circles. I've seen it very much personally. I've been a part of those, and I've also been somebody in those spaces and tried to make it something in my career where I have tried to create a wedge in between that conversation to offer men other perspectives, and to put myself in a position where I can say, hey, one, this isn't right, but we have to invite other voices into this conversation, because look what's happening. Right. Because just calling somebody out, or just saying you sound like a misogynist, people are going to be defensive about that, right? Like, and it's hard to create a dialogue when somebody, and you're automatically just, even though it's the truth, maybe, but you have to create some, like, here's what's happening as a result of that. And I think there's a bit of a reckoning that's started to happen, particularly within that. And I think there's again, I think that this has happened throughout throughout time that we've had this feeling there's momentum and there's progress, and then it kind of comes back. But I'm hopeful that we continue this momentum.
Absolutely. So one of your employees, who will remain nameless,
Sure.
although she'll come and do an episode with me.
All right. I have no idea who it is.
She told me a story because I said to her, "Oh my gosh, Ben is going to be doing Don't Stay Silent with me, and he wants to talk about toxic masculinity." And she was like, "Oh yes,
it's a light topic." Yeah.
He's about all day, every day. She shared a story with me about how the two of you were on a call, and she was, just taking a stance on something, and a male said to her, "You need to calm down." And you stopped him in his tracks immediately and said, "Don't you ever talk to her like that."
Mm-hmm.
It's something that matters so much to her, and she feels as if though she has a champion in you. And I just want to say a deep bow to you for that, because more people need to be doing that.
Yeah.
But to get back to the question, allyship, right? I think we've all learned that it's an action now, with all the focus coming out of Black Lives Matters and even 600 and rising. There's an action involved with calling yourself an ally.
Sure.
That having been said, how do you propose that men feel encouraged to stand up and speak out on the behalf of women?
Yeah. Well, first, before we even actually part one to that, I think is interesting, is this concept of calling yourself an ally. And I've talked to Black friends, colleagues, people in my community about this notion of what does it mean to call yourself an ally, and women too, right? I think it's interesting to say, like, that's a title that's given to you, I think, or should be. And I think it is in the work and it is in the actions, right? So you're absolutely right. And of course, being an ally is a action-oriented endeavor. We talk about things like performative allyship, which are a little bit vapid and empty. So that has to be filled with, again, sacrificing privilege and taking action, and whether that's, fiscally, whether that's for a job, whether that's for this example of this colleague who I have no idea who you're talking about. So I think that's an example of that. Again, just kind of to reiterate the theme of being vocal first and foremost, because other people, I do think, and other men I believe in other men, and I believe in especially a different generation of men that were maybe raised by women, that were that see that this is a extremely antiquated, just kind of like this whole notion of boys will be boys. That whole thing is crumbling, and because it's not supported by anything real. So I think other people, you'd be surprised that community can be created out of other men saying, you know what, actually, I wanted to say that too, but I didn't know if I should, because I didn't know how it would be perceived. So ultimately, that's the number one thing, is we have our privilege and our voice, and we need to put it on the line. It's interesting to see what happens when you do that, because people aren't trying to check you really when you do it. It's hard to have somebody say to you, challenge you in that space. If you put yourself out there, what is somebody going to come and say in an open space to you to say, no, I'm going to justify that I should tell that woman to calm down? Like, probably not. People don't like to be checked. People don't like to be tried, particularly in public. And I think, again, it's respectful. It's not, it may come off as contentious because it's just challenging, but it's more just like, this is not an acceptable behavior. So, and then to add to that, and again, I have no idea who this person is, but let's just say that this person was a woman of color. It adds another element, I think, to, again, this topic of intersectionality, that no man should ever say that to any woman. However, if a white man says that to a Black woman, I think we need to understand and highlight the fact that that is like, I mean, you could take it all the way back to, this is like generationally oppressor and the most oppressed person in history, right? So we have to understand the context of how that is, what that is, because nothing is void of context. So I think that's another element to it, that just like there are stereotypes that are created out of telling somebody to calm down. There are in front of a group of white people, and predominantly white men. And, you know, these are things that I think we need to, you know, be very, very mindful of. And fortunately, I do think there's a handful of, in our industry, you know, people coming together, and not just people that look like one another, although I think that representation is the #1 most important thing. I think 600 Rising is an incredible organization that I think is going to actually move the needle in our industry, but it's going to also take not performative allies, real allies, to help move that conversation forward, and sacrifice, right? So little things every day. And I think, you know, our group, and Publicists in general has done a really good job about creating that conversation, and giving diversity and inclusion a space, not just to say that it's a thing that we need to do, to say that it is the only way that the world moves forward, and this ultimately any organization.
Absolutely. And, you know, speaking of 600 and Rising, over the weekend, I found out that a memo was issued to the supporters and the signers. And there was language in there that really resonated with me. The president, Kim Young, had said about Black women that they are the most marginalized of us all. And as a Black woman, that definitely spoke volumes to me.
Sure.
That having been said, and I feel like you kind of talked about it, and I'd love for you to just build on it a little bit more. Why is it important for males to understand that there is a responsibility owed, especially to Black women?
Yeah, I find it incredible that man made that choice. It's incredibly brave and difficult, I would imagine. I'm neither Black nor a woman, but I do believe that, you know, it is going to take that type of sacrifice. And it's amazing to me that sacrifice, the amount of self-awareness that sacrifice came from a Black man, it's an incredible sacrifice, because that Black man deserves that seat at the table more than, like, that's not coming from a white man, right? Like that's saying, you know, there's an ultimate that's still recognition of privilege within this intersection world, right? That a Black man is saying, I'm Black, but I'm a man, and that Black women are the most oppressed people in every single space in the world. And that's just the case, regardless of Black women are the most educated group of people in the world. Any of those statistics to support that, that's an incredibly courageous and brave thing for him to have done. It is going to take a lot of sacrifice. I'd like to see more white men stand up to do similar things. Oftentimes, I think masculinity, and we kind of get back to this topic of, you know, from my view, I'm seeing a lot of like reinvention of masculinity coming from my like Black brethren, like my friends, people in my community that I'm seeing. There's an organization called the Dad Gang that you may or may not be familiar with. That's like, you know, I'm not seeing enough of that. I'm seeing a lot of that in the Black community. I'm not seeing a lot of that in white spaces as much, and I'd like to see more in terms of. But you know, there's an opportunity to be inclusive, for that to be, you know, a space for all men to come together to discuss this topic. But I see Black men leading in this area quite a bit, and it's amazing to see.
Absolutely, I gotta check out that Dad Gang.
The Dad Gang, yeah. And then there's also another, just quick plug. There's another organization by a gentleman named Jason Rosario called The Lives of Men, which is a social impact creative agency that is also exploring quite a bit of themes about, you know, masculinity, specifically Black masculinity, but masculinity in general, and the reinvention of it, and how to be sort of an ally and an advocate. And so those two organizations are doing some really great stuff in the space.
No, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So sticking with intersectionality for a minute, I feel as if though toxic masculinity shows up differently for white men than it does for Black men. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is the privilege ranking, and we sort of know where that is, right? We know that white men experience and have the most privilege of any group of people, right? Particularly white heterosexual men, if we really look at the entire scope of intersectionality. But I think it shows up differently because the world sees what that is differently. Masculinity is a construct. So as we know that whiteness and Blackness are constructs as well in the context that they're in. So the way that we see white masculinity is something that is, or the world has historically seen it, or white spaces is this way to perpetuate privilege and earning and being a man, and boys will be boys, and essentially a way to get away with behavior in many ways that's like for them, and also to be able to perpetuate and pass that on generationally. Like we talk about generational wealth, but we could talk about generational privilege in the same way. It's not just money, right? So I think it shows up very differently because, like, if white masculinity is like, in the way that the world sees that has historically been like this really good thing to have, right? And I think when we interrogate that a lot more, which we are doing, and more people are doing it, and being critical of themselves and aware and mindful, we understand that there's some serious cracks in that, and there's an opportunity to reinvent it. It's going to take a lot of work, but and so the way that Black masculinity shows up from somebody who, again, understands the male part of that, maybe, but again, those things are intersected, so doesn't understand the Black experience, although that's not a monolith. We know that too. We see how the world treats Black men, and particularly the types of language associated with, white masculinity is this thing, and Black masculinity or hyper Black masculinity is associated with really negative stuff, right? Like gangster culture, like all of that stuff, those really divisive words where like it starts to get, it's like, Bell Hooks talks a lot about this, but like she talks about Black masculinity, and there's like 10 kind of like different, she wrote 10 different essays. We Real Cool Black Men and Masculinity. There's 10 different essays, and it really talks about, what are these sort of different like archetypes, but also different ways of dispelling what those archetypes are. And I think that Black masculinity has proven the world wrong over and over and over again about how powerful that can be in a positive way, that white masculinity also tries to bring that down in many spaces, and with words, with media, with all different kinds of patriarchy. So I'm seeing there's always this interrogation of self-interrogation as well of Black masculinity, where Black men are talking about their masculinity and talking about how it evolves. And there's this conversation. I don't see that conversation that historically has happened as much amongst white men. And that's something that I've seen people get really uncomfortable with. And that's what it's going to take.
And I think you're right. I think that we have to start getting comfortable being uncomfortable. It means these conversations need to take place.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to kind of flip things on its head a little bit.
Sure.
Is there such a thing as toxic femininity? And what I mean by that is, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the Karens that are out there.
Sure. With this, we frame everything within the context of, like if we're framing this in the context of patriarchy, and we look at what this sort of this caricature of that is oftentimes real. What Karen actually represents is oftentimes, I think, a reaction to you know, a white woman's place within her own sort of space and within a white space. So I think that, you know, oftentimes you're hearing the white patriarchy disseminate these ideas. You heard this a little bit with like Donald Trump and getting elected in 2016. White women voted for Donald Trump at an exponential rate in 2016. Why? And then we know that that may be changing in the polls in 2020. Why is that the case? Why is that, you know, we talk about this thing where it's like men coming home, this antiquated idea, men coming home and talking about politics, and then women sitting at the, you know, all of these antiquated narratives and imagery sitting around and being like, well, my husband's voting for that person. You know, that part of that is that there's no question about it. Like there's a lack of maybe agency associated with it, but we do know that there's also aspects of it for within corporate spaces. Let's say sometimes we feel like, you know, there's a white woman that will be a leader who oftentimes is painted as something that a white man would be praised for, behavior that a white man would be praised for, right? So there is that element of why is this woman characterized as aggressive or any of these things when a man is very much praised for that same behavior. So we see them adopting that kind of behavior. The element of Karen, I think, adds a layer to it of obviously race, and it's just protecting privilege. It's another like name for somebody who cares more about their privilege than community. And James Baldwin said, like, you know, basically we're not free until everybody is free, right? Like the white world is not free until Black people are free, like in the truest sense. So I think that's what Karen is. But I mean, if we take that and put it into our work context, I think we see behaviors that are learned, constructed, and then repeated again, and then rewarded, you know, so there's a lot there. But
you just reminded me of something. I was an intern at an ad agency, which I don't even think is around anymore. And the most senior woman, she went by Joe. Her name was Josephine, but everything was Joe, Joe, Joe. And I think it's because she came up in a time where she wanted to be mistaken for a man because all of the men were the ones in leadership positions. So I think while it's okay to have a name like Karen or Molly or whatever it is, that's clearly a feminine name, some of those things are still with us that you're talking about.
Yeah. And also we had this brief discussion before, but this choice, I think particularly this choice that, you know, now we're like, how this has been playing around in my mind too a little bit, is this choice that Black women have always had to, as they've been faced with, as you've been faced with choices in your life about what space or what identity to, am I woman in this space? Am I Black in this space? You know, is there some sort of, within our industry or other industries, is there more, you know, is feminism something that is for everybody? Right? We saw that a little bit, you know, they talked about that in the feminist movement in like Gloria Steinem's feminist movement, where you saw Black women in that movement, but not at the same, you know, there was a civil rights fight going on, right? So you literally had to make a choice. So I think, is feminism now for everybody? And I hope the answer to that is yes, because then there needs to be like equality within that movement. And I think we've seen that prove difficult in areas, but it only works if it's inclusive.
And it's an age-old question, right? Because look at Sojourner Truth. She asks, "Ain't I a woman? Yes, I'm Black. I am also a woman."
Right.
And you know, I had a conversation in episode 1. Check it out. Janika Sams. We talked about code switching, and I think it's a survival skill. You know, as we navigate, you know, these different corporate waters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting that you bring that up. And I've always felt very privileged to be a part of a conversation with Black people about intimate things within the Black community, like code switching, like you know, respectability politics, and things that I felt like I've had to ask questions about to understand, and that I've been included in a conversation that I hopefully have been respectful about to understand a little bit more about. That's another thing that I think is required of any self-proclaimed or otherwise ally, is like asking the questions in a way that the language matters. Like, and that's not like cancel culture. Like, if you get it wrong, that it's done, you're canceled. Like, I think that that's really dangerous, and because nobody really grows like that. And I have my sort of, but being vulnerable enough to say, I don't know this, and like, I would like to know more, and I think I could be probably more effective if I knew more. Can I ask the questions about, if I'm a man, about being a woman, or how do you feel in this space, and how do you feel like you're valued at work? Like, simple question. Are you getting paid as much? Are you, you know, my wife is on maternity leave, and her company has an incredible policy, but a lot of women don't. And that's crazy. And like, talking to women about that, and men talking to women, it's like, so it's asking, the language matters, and being able to ask those questions, I think, are really important too.
For sure, for sure. And I think this is a great segue to kind of get a little personal.
Sure. Yeah.
So clearly, you're a male.
Yeah.
Also, you are a new father,
I am.
baby boy.
Yeah. His name is Ezra. He's doing great. Appreciate you.
Has first of all, toxic masculinity. Why does it matter to you so much? Because you came to me with this subject.
Sure.
Secondly, has anything changed about your viewpoints now that you're a father to a son?
Yeah. He's 4 weeks old. And to answer the second part of your question first, yes, like, things have arisen in me that I thought were like, maybe I put them to bed emotionally. Maybe I had done the work in therapy, or to kind of like put things behind me that happened in my own childhood as a boy, that like I thought I reconciled with. You know, there's different things that you think about, and it's a new world. It's in many ways a different world, right? So yes, there are things that I'm just finding, even in my reaction to his, you know, his month-old crying fits, right? I'm like, you know, I feel myself get very emotional. I feel myself get really worked up, but I don't want it to be aggressive. I don't want it to be like, I want it to be empathetic. I want it to be, and I'm struggling with that because like, I know he's like, you know, I don't know, he's a month old, and it's classic that happens, but like, you know, you think about, is he in pain? Is he, how do I sort of, how can I be there for him? How can I show up for him? I've thought about that stuff quite a bit, not to mention, you know, having a child, in a time where the world feels amplified in a negative way. So much information, this feeling that he's going to grow up in this place where it feels out of control at times. But ultimately, he's going to have a lot of privilege as well. And it's like, I'm going to have conversations with him about that my father never had with me. Mm-hmm. You know, my dad is a first generation Sicilian man, raised in New York. We have not always had we've had an off and on relationship. I was primarily raised by my mom and my grandmother. We've reconnected in ways now that I think he's displayed at 70 something years old, empathy and a capacity for change that, quite frankly, has restored some connection in us. Cause that's all I ever asked for, was him to be like aware of himself. I think, and like, to show that I was worth changing for, you know what I mean? And I think that, he's done some of the work, and I think I'm all good as long as you show me that you're doing the work. Even whatever, it's never too late, you know. And I think I want to do it a little earlier than maybe he did with my son. But I am excited at the same time to be amazed by something. I don't know when the last time I've been truly amazed. Like, even looking through his eyes now, I'm like, first of all, I don't even think you can see a foot in front of your face, but the world is crazy. And I think to watch you grow is going to be one of my greatest joys. And he, I know, will be a more compassionate, more empathetic, more genuine version of himself than I could probably ever aspire to be. And I don't even really know him that well, but you know, I'm going to put in the work, and I think that makes for better men.
Absolutely, and I think little Ezra is blessed to have you.
I appreciate you. I appreciate you.
So that concludes all our questions. I will ask one thing of you.
Okay.
And I got this from Auntie E on the Von Zahn. So
Yep.
I'm going to ask you, don't stay silent about 3 times, and I want for you to fill in the blank. You ready?
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Don't stay silent about.
Don't stay silent about your own, if your own privilege, meaning recognize it, put it to good work.
Mm-hmm. Don't stay silent about.
When you see somebody without that privilege being spoken down to or abused verbally in any way.
Last one. Don't stay silent about.
Don't stay silent about how you're doing. The world is overwhelming, and mental health is a real thing. And that's another thing within masculinity that, like, I'm lucky to have had the experience of, like, I struggled with the things that I struggled with, and I'm on my journey, and therapy and all those things have been a part of it. Doesn't have to necessarily be formal in terms of, but like, don't stay silent about what you're going through, whether that's within your community, your trusted group, or with a mental health professional. Life's too much of a burden to take on alone, mentally and emotionally. There's no question about that. And so, you know, people are there for you, and I think more than we think.
This has been an incredible conversation. Ben,
yeah, I really enjoyed it. No, thank you. And I will definitely check out episode 1. And then to everybody who's going to watch this, check out episode 2. But seriously, thank you for, I'm happy I caught this on LinkedIn. I'm happy I saw you, and we reconnected. And good luck with the rest of it.
Thank you so much.
All right.
All righty. Bye.
All right.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.